the athlete has more confidence in you. Not only do they respect your scientific training and interpretation, but they also know that when you say that you could do with doing a little bit more speed training in this area, that actually you know what you're talking about because you will have done that session yourself.
This is Running for Real, the podcast for runners who know that for every runner's high, there are just as many lows. All those just missed PRs, easy runs that feel hard, injury blues, and more. Each week, we'll talk to running, health, and wellness experts about their highs, lows, and best advice to build our confidence. Running for Real is about being honest, being brave, and most of all, not feeling alone. And now here's our host, whose favorite pizza is Giordano's in Chicago, Tina Muir.
Hello, my friends. Welcome to episode 48 of the Running for Real podcast. I am so thankful that you are here today and you are in for a bit of a treat. Last week we had Kim Jones on the show, a 2:26 marathoner, but she had an incredible story, was very raw and emotional, and the story is really not what it seems, but it makes you think about how easy we assume other people's lives are when they're having success, but it's not necessarily what's going on behind the scenes, so make sure you check that out if you haven't already listened to it. Today we have Andrew Jones, Professor of Applied Physiology in the Department of Sport and Health Sciences, and Associate Dean for Research in the College of Life and Environmental Sciences. Those are his titles. But more importantly, today you're going to learn about some of the projects he has helped within the running world. I'm talking the sub 2-hour marathon project with Nike. He was the major physiologist involved with that. He was also Paula Radcliffe's primary physiologist and helped figure out some stuff that was going on with her that actually led to huge improvements in her performance, and we all know where that ended up. So really, really special guest today. So after a quick word from V and Body Health, we will be right to the interview. You know, when you're out there running and you're really struggling and you do listen to music just to kind of help get you through, the quality of the headphones really makes such a huge difference. And V, in addition to being a great running buddy and training partner, has amazing sound. Make sure you check it out at getv.com/runningforreal. New year, new you. Well, kind of. By now, most of us know that big New Year's resolutions really don't stick most of the time. But small ones that we can actually stick to, they will make a heck of a difference. Just like adding Body Health Perfect Amino to your routine made a big difference for me, and it could to you too. Andy, thank you so much for joining me on this episode of the Running for Real podcast. I am really excited about this one and really thankful that you are here. So thanks for joining us.
My pleasure.
Okay, so before we kind of get on to your work, which is I know the part that my audience is going to be very interested in, I kind of wanted to talk about your beginning first, just a little bit here. You are a physiologist. We're going to kind of talk about how you've worked with some of the highest level athletes in the sport, including the one and only Paula Radcliffe. But before we do, from what I was reading, you still hold the British junior half marathon record on a pretty tough course in 66 minutes, 55 seconds. Now, for most of my audience, that time is going to blow their mind on a normal day, let alone running it as a junior. So maybe tell us a bit about your running background, at the younger level, and then why you kind of transitioned into your career being more around other athletes rather than yourself.
Yeah, it's one of the things I'm really quite proud of, even now, is that record. It's actually not the UK junior record, it's the UK under 18 record. So I guess that makes it even faster, but I ran the 66:55 when I was 17. And in that same year, I ran 30 minutes and 13 seconds for the 10K, which at that time was also a British under 18 record. But I think that's got beaten since. So I think that's now the second fastest of all time. But the half marathon record has stood for 30 years now. So I'm very
amazing.
I was pretty successful as a junior runner, as a sort of a youth and such like, as we call it in the UK. Ran 1,500 meters, 5,000. Got a couple of British bests one on the track, which was a 5,000 meter representative fixture, and then also in the Youth Olympics in the road race. There was an 8-kilometer road race that I took part in. So all that was good, and I used to run for a very sort of famous and successful club at that time, Newport Harriers in South Wales, and there've been a few good athletes from that club over the years. And I think I was really keen to take my running career as far as it could go. And the reason that I chose to study sports science was because I was fascinated by the physiology and the science generally that underpinned elite athletic performance. And I thought by studying it further, because I was getting into that literature just in my spare time anyway to sort of inform my own training, because I was more or less self-coach, that I thought that would propel me to the next level. But unfortunately, like a lot of promising runners, when they go away from home for the first time away to university, they find that they haven't got that support structure around them, and the nutrition probably goes downhill, and they start to get ill and injured, and they start to have gaps in their training. And while that was happening for me, I started to pick up more and more on the science thing. I became, as a lot of runners are a bit obsessive about things, aren't they? And I'm no exception.
Putting it mildly.
I started to get more obsessive about the science, and really focused on that. Managed to get a first class degree, and then had the opportunity to stay on and do a PhD in exercise physiology. And that was actually looking at the science of distance running. During that period was when I actually started to work with Paula Radcliffe for the first time. So I'm sure we'll discuss that shortly. But I think starting to work with her made me realise that while I was obviously a good athlete, I wasn't going to be quite as good as I really wanted to be. When you're training really hard and it becomes the main thing in your life, you want to achieve the highest level possible. You want to be the world record holder and the Olympic champion and things like that. And I think I realised through my work with Paula and others was that I wasn't going to be quite that good, and there were other people that were that good, and I was better off, trying to help them to achieve their potential. So it was good. It was good meeting her, because it meant that I could sort of transition a little bit. So I think to be an elite athlete, you have to have all your ducks lined up. You have to have the right anthropometry, the right physiology, the right psychology. And I had one or two of those, but I didn't have all three. So I might have got to an Olympics, but I certainly wouldn't have won an Olympic gold medal. And
that says a lot about your personality as well. The fact that I'm not sure everyone could take that step. Like, seeing that okay, I'm maybe not going to reach that top level, and I'm going to actually do something where I can really make a difference in other people's lives. But I feel like most people would really struggle and kind of fight against it a lot more. So that really is amazing to see. Shows a lot about who you are, that you kind of made that choice to be like, I'm going to help others, rather than just kind of trying to see what I can do, and maybe it'll work, but maybe it won't. So really, really cool to hear. And it's interesting you mentioned that drop off as well at university that you went through, because the one thing I've noticed with the US and the UK is that in the UK, it is that first year of university that big drop off happens. Whereas over in the US, it's after university that the huge drop off happens. So it was kind of interesting hearing you say that, just as someone who was incredibly successful in their final years of school, but it still kind of came to bite you in that first year of university. So pretty cool.
It was a struggle, actually. I'm not, going to say it was an easy transition. Yeah. It was tough, because you cling on to it for a while, and you keep training, and then you get another illness, but before you know it, you wake up one day and you find that actually the thing that's become more important is the science or the education. And I mean, I'm not going to say that I'm doing it all for the love of helping other people either. You pursue success in some other walk. That's what I did. I transitioned. So I think like a lot of people who want to be great at running, they want to be successful at running. And if they can't be successful at running, they prefer to be successful at something else. So I think helping people was something that came alongside it. I think more driven by achieving the highest I could in something else.
Yeah, that makes total sense. Right. Okay, that makes total sense. Thank you for explaining that, and interesting to hear. Now, for the listeners who do not know about what you are kind of, I guess, famous for, other than obviously working with some of the top people we're going to talk about, is about Beetroot. So much so that your Twitter handle is Andy Beetroot, which for my US listeners, yes, I am talking about beets. But firstly, tell us, what is it about Beetroot, and kind of let's talk a bit about that. What has your work with Beetroot kind of done and found?
Yeah, good question. So I'm often asked that, why did you get into studying beetroots? And it's one of the things I'm interested in scientifically, especially, if you're a runner and you're interested in physiology, you're interested in endurance, and you're interested in oxidative metabolism. In other words, oxygen uptake, because oxygen uptake is you have to take it in to respire aerobically. So things like VO2 max and running economy or efficiency, the efficiency with which you use oxygen is important. The highest metabolic rate you can sustain. I study something called VO2 kinetics. So when you're on the start line and the gun fires, how quickly can you turn on your aerobic system, deliver oxygen to your muscles and use that oxygen? And so I'm fascinated by all things related to oxygen uptake. And I stumbled across this article in a fairly obscure scientific journal about a drug, I suppose, a pharmaceutical agent called sodium nitrate. Mm-hmm. What these researchers had shown was that when they gave their participants sodium nitrate for a few days and then measured their oxygen uptake during a standard exercise test, that for any given work rate, the oxygen uptake was lower. In other words, muscle had become strangely more efficient, which was very surprising. And frankly, I didn't believe it. But it was intriguing. And I appreciated that if actually this intervention had made muscle a bit more efficient, then that had real implications for performance. So we did an immediate sort of follow-up study where we looked at the effect of nitrate, but we didn't use the drug sodium nitrate, or the chemical. We used a naturally occurring form of nitrate, which is inorganic nitrate, which is in abundance in not only beetroots, but also a variety of green leafy vegetables like rocket, as I'd call it, or arugula, and various spinaches and lettuces and things like that. Beetroot juice is good because you know exactly how much nitrate you're administering to somebody, and it's very easy to consume compared to eating, say, a head of lettuce or a bag of spinach or something.
Other than the taste.
Yeah.
Anyway, keep going.
And to our great surprise, we confirmed what had been reported in that article that I mentioned, which was that when we fed people beetroot juice for a few days, that their oxygen uptake for a given power output on a cycle ergometer was lower. And not only that, but when we asked them to exercise to exhaustion at a high intensity, they went further. So that was the first study which inspired us and others to sort of pursue that kind of inquiry for a few more years, and we're still going strong on that, really.
Yeah, and it's definitely spun off. And beetroot or beet has become huge, one of the major kind of recovery products known out there, and there's now beetroot powder products. And actually, speaking of that, for someone who is listening thinking, I just can't even stomach it. I mean, I quite like it actually, but a lot of people say, it's too earthy for me. How does the products like Beet Elite or one of the other beetroot product powders, does that work just as well, or does it come better from the natural source itself?
We've actually just published a paper just in the last couple of days in a journal called Nitric Oxide, which compares quite a few of the commercially available nitrate supplements. So we've got the beetroot crystals in there. We've got something called a beetroot flapjack, and we've got the concentrated nitrate shot, and we've got the long beetroot juice drink. And there are some subtle differences between them. But what's more striking, I think, is that if you take the chemical, like I mentioned, the sodium nitrate or the potassium nitrate, it isn't actually as effective as if you take the same amount of nitrate in a natural product like beetroot or spinach or something else. And there seem to be other, bioactive compounds within natural foods that augment the effectiveness of the nitrate.
Okay. So it's always, as always, I kind of knew the answer to that. It's always better to have it from the natural source if possible. And as you mentioned, it doesn't have to just be beetroot. It could be, other leafy green vegetables as well. And then while you were interested in this kind of recovery products, I'm assuming this kind of led you to maybe to look into some other things that would be helpful, especially when it comes to food sources. So are there any other ones, we often hear of tart cherry juice, sweet potatoes, salmon, as a few that kind of come to mind. Are there any other ones that in your research you've kind of found have also had kind of powerful effects?
Nothing like nitrate does. So all of the other things that you mentioned there may or probably are effective in some way. I think their effects are slightly less profound in some ways, but it doesn't mean to say they shouldn't be part of a natural diet or a athlete's diet. Okay. Things like cherry juice are better in recovery, and they contain a lot of polyphenols. So when you exercise long and hard, you produce a lot of free radicals, which can, on the one hand, can actually be responsible for the adaptation that we see, but they can also be somewhat damaging as well. So taking antioxidants and things like polyphenols, which are in cherries, also in beetroot juice, can sort of help the recovery process a bit. The nitrate we generally recommend pre-exercise rather than post-exercise.
Okay, and how much are you talking here?
Well, several days, 2 to 3 days prior to a major competition and on the morning of. A couple of we use Beetroot quite a bit. They've got a 70 milliliter shot, which contains about 6 to 8 millimoles. That seems to be about the right amount. I mean, you're right to point out that actually taking a whole variety of different nitrate-containing foodstuffs as part of a balanced diet is really the way forward. And we're interested not just in the athletic performance benefits. I mean, obviously, that's what this discussion with you today is more interested in. But actually, we find that if you consume high nitrate foodstuffs, that you can lower your blood pressure as well. So, in terms of longer-term cardiovascular health, then, having a high nitrate diet tends to reduce a person's blood pressure by, between 2 and 5 millimeters of mercury, which actually, if that were replicated across the population of the US, for example, then the incidence of heart attacks and strokes would go down quite a lot.
Well, okay. Well, that's another good thing to know about it then, I guess. Okay. And then in addition to doing, you've done over 250 research studies that, from what I can see, and we can kind of talk about some that are particularly interesting to runners. But before we kind of get to those, you've also been a consultant to a number of governing bodies, including UK Athletics, English Institute of Sport, Gatorade, and Nike. So maybe just kind of give us a bit of background, I guess. I know it's obviously going to depend on the company itself, but what kind of thing did that involve with you working with those companies?
It does vary quite a bit, actually. Sometimes it's just advice. Sometimes it's working directly with athletes. Sometimes it's advising on, product development, if it's more of a commercial organization. It's a whole variety of things, really. I mean, I've got an interest with Exeter Chiefs Rugby, for example, as well. I've got a PhD student there that's looking at injury rates and what we might be able to do to offset that. I do a little bit of work each year with the Welsh Rugby Union. I would go down because that's another, as a Welshman, I'm passionate about
yep.
as well as athletics. It really depends. I guess as my career has gone on, I do a little bit less hands-on stuff with athletes. Actually, I was working with British distance runners before the English Institute of Sport existed. And so that was when I was based in Brighton and then in Manchester in particular. That was quite central to England, as you know. So I used to get athletes travelling long distances just to have a test done and to talk about what that meant in terms of their strengths and weaknesses and how their training might be altered as a consequence. But as I've become kind of a bit more senior academically, and I'm also now down in the extreme southwest of England, I don't do so much of the actual hands-on stuff, but often I've I think helped in advising some of the other physiologists that are doing the hands-on work these days.
Okay. And then there may not be anything that comes to mind for you, but is there anything you can think of specifically that you've learned through working with those, big governing bodies about athletics at the very top level, like maybe some things that kind of surprised you, especially when you were working, one-on-one with these runners, but just in general, as to kind of trends and things that you noticed?
That's a really hard question to answer because it would be impossible to generalize, I think. I don't think there's anything that's been really surprising. With any one individual athlete, they've all got their, certain strengths and weaknesses and approaches and, without kind of delving into what made them. It's hard to do that. No, that's a tricky one.
Yeah, that's okay. I know that's a bit of a strange question. I just I thought I would ask it just in case. So let's talk about a specific. I mentioned Paula Radcliffe. You were working with her. Maybe tell us about what your involvement was when you were working with Paula, and how that kind of developed over time.
Yeah, so I mentioned just in response to your last question that I was starting to sort of specialise in working with runners even before the English Institute of Sport came into existence. And that, I think, that was true in the UK, that you had individual academics in certain sports science departments, even before sports science became as big as it is today, that were interested in athletics and sometimes would have athletes in. In part it was to do, they were interested in having those elite athletes as a specialist population for a research study to generate new information. A lot of that didn't do the reputation of physiologists any good, because quite often they were used as guinea pigs, those athletes. The data were taken from them and they didn't really get a lot of help or feedback about what that information actually meant to the athlete or the coach. My approach had always been very different to that. So when I was doing my PhD, it was really about how can we evaluate runners in a very valid and reliable fashion and derive information that can help them run faster, so we can unpick what are the limitations to their performance and what can we do to remedy any deficiencies that we see. So I was starting to do that sort of thing. Actually, my relationship with Paula began as a consequence of my running career rather than my academic career. Well, the two kind of collided. So at the time that Paula was starting to come to the fore as a junior runner herself, I think the national junior cross country coach was a guy called Bud Baldaro, who's
I know Bud. Everyone knows Bud.
Yeah, and he was very good friends with my coach, or the head coach at Newport Harriers, a guy called Mike Rowland. I don't know if you know Mike.
I've heard of him. Yep.
Yeah, he's had a lot of success with a lot of runners as well, and I think Paula was started to become hugely successful, but then had a sudden dip in form, really. And this had come to Bud's attention, and he knew of me through Mike, and then they got old, and they knew I was studying for my PhD in, the physiology of distance running at the University of Brighton, which wasn't very far away from Bedford, where Paula was based. And so I think Bud suggested to Paula and her coaches, Alex and Rosemary Stanton, that maybe she could come down and maybe I could uncover, what it was that was explaining why her performance had taken a bit of a dive. And she came down and we did a standard battery of tests on the treadmill, but we also do a lot of resting measurements as well. We look at things like everything from height and weight to flexibility to lung function to hemoglobin concentration, just trying to look at all the respiratory, cardiovascular, muscular aspects that can impact or impinge on an athlete's welfare and performance. And one of the things that she actually ran really well on the treadmill. There was nothing especially untoward about that, even though she wasn't in a prime condition. Values that she was generating on the treadmill were still actually quite impressive. But interestingly, her hemoglobin concentration suggested that she might have some iron deficiency anemia. And of course, that will impact on her ability to run. And so we kind of identified that, suggested that she have some follow-up medical tests. So she had some further hematology done, and sure enough, her serum ferritin was low, which is a very sensitive marker of iron status.
Do you remember what number it was, just for? Because I have had an episode about ferritin in the past, just for people's reference.
It was less than 20, I think.
Okay, so pretty low then.
Pretty low, yeah. And of course, so once you identify what the problem is, then you can remedy it. So she had some therapy to get that back to normal, and she went from really not running very well. I think she'd had, I can't remember the details, but I think in the Bedfordshire County Cross Country Championships is my recollection, she hadn't had a good run. And then she'd come to the lab and we'd identified this issue, and then she'd had some medical help to sort it out. And then she won the World Junior Cross Country Championships, which I think was in Boston, wasn't it, that year? It was a very snowy...
Yeah, I don't actually know.
So she'd gone from not very good in the county on that particular day to winning the World Cross Country Championship. So I think that made her think that maybe something in this, So she started to come back pretty regularly, between 2 and 4 times per year for the next 10 years plus, probably.
Wow.
Built up that kind of rapport, and every time she came, she got a little bit better, but her set of data changed somewhat as a consequence of the types of training that she'd done. And then we'd think about what the implications would be for the next block of training. And it just unfolded like that. And I got to know her physiology so well that it was quite not easy, but it was possible to predict her performances initially at, say, 3,000 meters and then 5,000 and 10,000, and then ultimately in the marathon. And I think that gave her confidence going into those races as to what she might be capable of achieving.
For sure, yeah. And how cool to be involved in a process like that and see her kind of come along the way she did. I mean, that's amazing. And one funny story for you, Andy, is I actually trained at Bedford for a year and a half, between, what would it have been, 2004 to 2006, something around there. And at one point I was really struggling in my running, just feeling tired all the time, just kind of struggling. And Alex said to me, maybe you're anemic. You should go on some iron tablets. And I did. And I did start to feel better, but I wonder if that kind of working with you, with Paula, kind of made him, that's his first thing. If someone's like struggling is, well, maybe it's this. So just kind of funny you mentioned that of all things.
For female distance runners, it's certainly something to be considered, for sure.
Sure.
I think we know more about that now than we did back in the 80s and 90s.
Yeah, but definitely. And then I don't know if you will know the answer to this, but I have had people on to talk about it before. But if you had a different opinion for someone who does get blood work regularly done, I know my audience know I'm a big fan of company Inside Tracker for blood work, but if they do get it done and the ferritin is kind of low, do you have a rough level that you kind of suggest people start to look at doing things? I mean, the one I hear often is under 35, but
the truth is, I don't think we really know. I mean, so you can have a pretty normal hemoglobin concentration, but a very low ferritin.
Yes.
The ferritin does seem to be the thing that impacts the way people feel and the way they run. So it is always worth, I think. You can get over sophisticated and you can get a lot of blood work done and you get bewildered with a load of numbers, some of which look low and some look high, and they're probably not really relevant to you at all. So you can get obsessed with this stuff. But we do know that serum ferritin is actually a pretty good index of iron status, and and it is going to make a difference to performance. So, but what we don't know is, I think when you set generalized thresholds, it's that isn't always helpful. So for somebody, a serum ferritin of 55 might be low enough where it's actually altering their performance. For others, it might not be until it's less than 20.
Okay.
I mean, for me, I think as soon as it goes under 50, alarm bells might start to ring. But yeah, I agree. Then you've got 35 and then you've got 20. Once you're under 20, I think you're struggling.
For sure. Okay. Well, thank you. And then one thing that you wrote, or I can't remember if you wrote it or someone else wrote it about you in 2007, with regards to kind of working with Paula, was that there wasn't many elite sports performers, you kind of mentioned this earlier, who were working with sports scientists, especially in a positive manner. So would you say that's changed since 2007, or is there still kind of that disconnect?
I definitely think it's changed. I think with the advent of the EIS, I worked for a while at the Welsh Institute of Sport as well, and I think that was that actually existed before the English Institute of Sport and was based on the Australian Institute of Sport. And there's good practice going on in Canada, and I don't think it's particularly widespread in the US, but there are some good people there. I think the key to making sports science work for the benefit of athletes and coaches is that the physiologist or the scientist that they're working with has an affinity for the sport. I think it's quite crucial. And the reason I mentioned my experience at the Welsh Institute of Sport was that I was spread pretty thinly while I was there for the 18 months that I was there. And I was working with women's football and rugby and squash and triathlon, all sorts of sports, not all of which I really knew anything about, let alone cared about in some cases. Whereas if it's runners, you can relate to them and you can speak the same language as them. And I think there's a bit of a rapport built up straight away, because, the athlete has more confidence in you if not only do they, respect your scientific training and interpretation, but they also know that when you say, these data might suggest that you could do with doing a little bit more mileage or a bit more speed training in this area, that actually you know what you're talking about because you will have done that session yourself. Mm-hmm. I wouldn't have any, if I went to somebody when I was still running and they were giving me a load of advice and I knew they'd never run a step in their lives or they hadn't done it very well if they had, I wouldn't take it seriously. So, I think that kind of, it's that connection that's important. So that's why I've always specialized, not just in endurance sports, but in runners especially. Mm-hmm.
No, that makes a lot of sense. And actually, you see that quite a lot with physiotherapists or physical therapists where, when they're a runner and they get it, immediately the runner going to see them listens and trusts them. Whereas if it's someone, who has no interest in runners, thinks runners are crazy and stupid, then, it's easy to put up that wall and kind of when they tell you to do something, think, well, they don't really care anyway. So yeah, I definitely see that in other things as well. Okay, so now I wanted to talk about, the recent thing you did with Nike, as we say in the UK, this is confusing for me, not knowing which word to say here.
I say Nike now as well.
You do? You say... Yeah, I know. Americanized. So you worked with them on the 2-hour project. So kind of maybe tell us a bit about your involvement with that, as you did kind of act as a consultant to Nike during that time. And I think people will be very interested to hear what your involvement was.
Yeah, so I'd been, myself and a few other people around the world, people like Mike Joyner at the Mayo Clinic, had started to think for a little while about, is this possible? What would be required to make it happen? What would the athlete need to look like physiologically? What kind of conditions would you need to have to make it a viable thing? And we've been getting progressively closer to 2 hours, as you've seen. Mm-hmm. There's been the record has been broken quite a few times over the last 10 or 15 years, and we're in the 202s now legitimately. So, people have started to speculate about that quite a bit, not just in the scientific world, but in the athletic community as well, of course. And there's a suggestion that Paula's 2:15:25 is actually pretty much equivalent to a 2-hour marathon anyway. And of course, she ran that in a race where she was surrounded by men. So that may provide some clue. But our feeling was that, unlike things like the 1,500 meters, the marathon world record is way slower than a human would potentially be capable of running it. And that's for a whole variety of different reasons. One is that you can't run a marathon so frequently as you can run a 1,500 meter race. So catching the optimal conditions is going to be key. But also that athletes have the opportunity to really avoid one another. Somebody could sign for Chicago, another for Berlin, another for London, and so on. So you rarely get all of the best athletes in the same race at the same time. Or if you do, it's in an Olympics or a World Championships where the goal is to win the race rather than to run as quickly as possible. And also the course and environmental conditions aren't often ideal in those situations. So one of the factors, in order to understand just how fast the best humans could run a marathon is to try, there's two things you can do, and ideally you do both, is get as many of those best runners into a race at the same time in their best condition. But secondly, you optimize things around them. You choose a course that's perfect, you get environmental conditions that are ideal, you look at things like pacing and drafting and so on. Anyway, so Nike had heard me speculating about some of these considerations in various talks that I'd done. They were obviously starting to think about, that it's getting precariously close to 2 hours, and obviously that would like the person to break 2 hours to do it in Nike gear. That's probably one of the things that motivated them, as well as the scientific question. And I think once they'd started to commit to actually pursuing the sub 2 hour marathon, that they felt that they needed additional expertise from outside. So they didn't have any sort of specialist running physiologists, I think, working within Nike in Portland, Oregon. So I guess they decided I was going to be the go-to guy as far as that went, which was great for me, a very exciting thing to be part of. And so I was the scientific advisor to Nike on the project, and that involved quite a few things, and not least of which was to help them select the athletes that were going to be most capable of attempting it in the first place. So we started with quite a long list of the athletes that Nike sponsor, and gradually filtered that down. Some of them weren't available in the timescale that we needed. Some had other commitments. Some were injured. And then we got it down to around 20 that we brought into the laboratory, either here in Exeter or over in Portland, Oregon, where Nike are based. And from that 20 or so, we did laboratory tests, we did field-based tests, we looked at their past performances, we considered a whole variety of factors, and we narrowed it down to the 3 that we eventually selected. So part of my role was to help Nike select 3, but then there was a whole bunch of discussion. Every week we'd have a phone call starting to talking about, where should we do this? What time of year should we do this? What time of day should we do this? What are the energetic considerations? If we've selected the athletes, how do we ensure that they're going to be in their best condition on the day in question? How do we work with their coach to optimize their training? Is there anything wrong with their training at the moment, or is it perfect? What can we learn from what they do? And then the other role I played a bit was on the nutritional side of things as well, just making sure a bit of nutrition education. We do know that when you run a marathon, that hydration is important and carbohydrate availability is important, and just trying to individually optimize the nutrition, both pre-race and in race, and also for support training was something else that we gave a lot of consideration to.
Yeah, very interesting. And just one question before we kind of get on, I want to hear a bit more about, when you went out to select the athletes going to Kenya. But what you said that you selected 3, or there were 3 selected. Why was it? It sounds silly, just 3. Why did they not go for a big group of 10 to 15 guys who were really going to kind of go at this? Why was 3 kind of the chosen number?
I don't know the answer to that. I think that's a question for Nike. I think some of it would have been financial, because obviously those runners had to be bought out of whatever other race they might have done, their appearance fee and their prize money and so on. So, and I think as soon as you have Kipchoge in the mix, your ability to, we probably could have had 6 or 8 if we hadn't had Kipchoge. Obviously, we're glad we did select Kipchoge. Yeah. So things like that come into consideration. But perhaps the ideal thing is to have a much larger group of athletes, even if you don't think they're quite capable of it, but they commit to running at that pace for as long as they can. And if you did that, then you wouldn't have to bring in the fresh pacemakers. I mean, one of the reason that obviously the time that was run, the 2 hours 00:25 seconds, the only reason that doesn't count as a world record was because we rotated pacemakers in and out. Now, we didn't think that was unduly unrealistic, because if you had a situation where you could get all the best runners in the same race on the same day, and they committed to running as fast as possible for as long as they each individually could, and they shared the pacemaking and the drafting, then you could take an athlete to, the one who eventually gets as close as possible to the 2. You could probably take them to 22, 24, 25 miles. The issue when people have run 2.2, 2.3, 2.4 is that quite often they haven't given much consideration to their drafting, even in the first 20 miles, but very often they're on their own for the remainder of the race. And we know that there's an oxygen cost and energy cost of running on your own and into the wind. So if you can shelter from that a bit, you can go substantially faster. So we wanted to replicate what could happen if you could create those optimal conditions.
Okay.
In a major race. That's why we use the pacemakers. Yeah.
Okay. That makes sense. Interesting. All right. And then you said you selected it. And you did say you went to Kenya. What was it you learned from the experience of being out there about the Kenyan athletes themselves, for listeners who are interested in, what makes them just so much better than so many, other countries around the world?
Yeah, so we had the opportunity to go to both Kenya and Ethiopia, actually. So to compare and contrast, the approach there was quite interesting. We didn't go to Eritrea because Zerzane Tedesse's coach is a Spaniard, and he was training in Madrid. So we went to Madrid and we spent a week with them. But we had we did go to Kenya and to Ethiopia, and it was I'd been to Kenya several times before as part of the UK Athletics setup, because we have an altitude base up in. Up there at what's it called, I-10. So I'd been there a few times, and I'd observed some of the Kenyans training and so on. But it was great to see Kipchoge's camp. And I think the thing that strikes you is how together they all are for a start. It's one big happy camp where there's it's all for one and one for all kind of thing. Real good mentality about it. Very simple existence, very non-flashy. They train hard, they recover hard, they don't distract themselves with peripheral stuff. Mm-hmm. And it's a very natural and beautiful setting. It's a lovely environment. They get up very early. They start to run before sunrise often. They don't have fantastic facilities, but there's plenty of them, and they work hard, and they've got a good spirit about them. And the same is true in Ethiopia as well. There's a bit of a difference. It's a little bit more kind of more aggressive, a little bit more cutthroat, I'd say, in Ethiopia compared to Kenya, where it's really quite sort of serene most of the time. But fascinating, and clearly what they're doing there, they've done well for generations. So there's a lot to learn from it. Some of it is about the simplicity. I think in Europe and in America, we can get a bit overcomplicated in setting training programs, for example. We obsess over the details. They listen to themselves very well. They listen to the environment. They cut back on things sometimes, and they don't feel bad about it. Sometimes if they feel good, they'll push harder. Mm-hmm. One thing that's very distinctive about what they do, compared to what I'm used to in the UK at least, is that conventionally the Sunday long run is one of the slowest runs of the week. So if you go out and you do whatever's appropriate for you, 10 miles, 15 miles, 20, whatever, that tends to be long and slow and relatively easy. And then when you do shorter, steady runs during the week, they'll tend to be a little bit faster. Mm-hmm. And that's flipped on its head somewhat certainly in Kenya, and I think in Ethiopia as well to some extent. So that sometimes when they just go out for a steady run, you'd be amazed at how slowly they go.
Yeah.
Really, really
it's
slow.
Like 9-10 minute pace, isn't it?
Yeah.
Per mile.
Yep. Yeah, incredible. However, when they do a long run, let's say it's a 20-miler, it might start slow for the first 2 or 3. I mean, but actually 100 athletes will show up for the start of this long run, and it'll start really, really easy, but it gradually accelerates, and it becomes a very specific session. Actually, it's one of the hardest sessions of the week, I'd say, and they end up, it's kind of last man standing. It almost becomes a burn-up, and the top athletes are at the front of that, and they're finishing probably 5-minute miling after they've started at 10.
Yeah. That's interesting. And I love hearing that because, that's always kind of the same philosophy I've believed in with long runs, that they shouldn't all be that kind of plod along. And it's good to hear. And especially also about how easy they take their easy days as well. And then what about, you mentioned, simple life, back off when they need to, go harder when they need to. How does stress come into it? In our Western culture, we're very, I've got to do this, I've got to do that, I've got 100 things to do, I'm so busy, blah, 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 blah. How does that kind of come into it?
It doesn't come into it as the answer. It's so relaxed though. It's great. They come back and they just live a very simple, very humble existence. They're not, watching TV or on video games or on phones. They don't have a huge list of things to do. Mm-hmm. They come back and they shower, and the way they shower is they haul up a well of cold water. A bucket of cold water from a well. They haven't got hot running water at this point. They've got very simple dormitories. I mean, Kipchoge is the elder statesman in the group, shares probably the smallest room in the whole place with the youngest athlete because, they mentor one another. It's fantastic. And they just hang out together. They chat, they chill, they drink tea, and they don't have, I don't think they have a cook come in or a cleaner or anything. They're responsible for doing all of that stuff themselves. So they'll wash out their kit, hang it on, and they'll just unwind. And they have this ability, I think, to switch off from their running. When they're running, they're very serious about it. But when they're not running, and they don't worry about either what the next session's going to be or anything else that might interfere with their ability to recover. So there's a lot to be learned, I think, from the way they go about that. For
sure, yeah. And I think you've given, people listening something to think about as well. And then what about diet? We often hear little snippets of what diet is like for Kenyan runners, but we've kind of started at the beginning with how important it is to eat those good foods, and I'm guessing without that stress that we've just talked about, they don't worry about I have to be a certain way, I have to hit this number on a scale. What did you notice about the diet and the way they approach that?
Not a lot other than it's very simple. They drink a lot of milky tea. They eat a lot of very plain, straightforward food, not a lot of meat. It's quite vegetarian, I would say. It's different in Ethiopia. They eat a lot more meat actually, but in Kenya they don't particularly. Occasionally they'll have some meat or some fish. They have a lot of rice. They have a lot of ugali. So this is kind of it's very difficult to explain what that's like, but they love it. It's very,
and eat it late at night, right? Don't they?
They eat it all times of day. Yeah.
Okay, because when I did London twice, I remember hearing that the Kenyan athletes were eating their dinner at like 11 p.m. with the race the next morning, eating the ugali. So
yeah, that surprised me. Yeah, and actually, when we went to Monza for the break-in 2 attempt, we had to make sure there was a proper ugali chef there to supply everybody with their favourite substance. Trying to think and they actually have a lot of green leafy vegetables as well. I'd love to analyse their diet for nitrate, but I think it's probably likely to be very high. They have a lot of sort of wilted spinach and greens type stuff. I don't know if it's actually spinach, but that type of thing.
Yeah, for sure. I'm sure it's the same. Well, cool. Thank you for sharing. And then, so just overall with that project, did you see it as a success, or was it just so close that it was, almost like rubbing salt in the wound? What was your overall reflection on the whole thing?
I think it was great. I mean, I think actually Kipchoge was disappointed. He genuinely believed that he would do it, and even though he ran so incredibly quickly, he was disappointed that he didn't run faster. And you can hear, I don't know if you've watched the National Geographic Break Into documentary, but he's interviewed shortly after it's a great watch. Shortly after he's finished, and you can sort of see the disappointment etched on his face. But I think on reflection, he says now that he's run 2 hours, which he's the only one ever to have done that.
Yeah.
He ran 2.5 minutes faster than anybody else has, 6 seconds per mile faster than anybody else has, and we're within 1 second per mile now of going underneath. And so I think that it has to be considered a success. I mean, there are so many things that can go wrong with a marathon that whole thing could have been an absolute disaster.
Yes.
He could have done everything right, and Kipchoge might not have felt very good that day, or and he might have run 2:06 or something, 2:10 or whatever. It could have been terrible. They could have all finished. We could have had a situation where none of them made the start line, or several of them didn't, or they didn't make the finish line. So I think it has to be, and I think I would imagine that there are people in Kenya now and in East Africa generally and around the world who are promising athletes, 16, 17, 18-year-olds who now are dreaming that actually it could be them.
Yeah.
They the person to break that landmark.
Mm-hmm.
So I think we've changed the mindset a bit, and I wouldn't be surprised that as and when somebody does do it, and I think they inevitably will, that they will, there'll be a raft of them that then follow. I'm not saying it'll happen really soon, but I think we've expedited the point at which it will occur.
Yeah, no, really. Cool. Thank you for sharing. Okay, I'm just going to take a moment to thank our sponsors, and we will finish off with the Running for Real 4. Are you bored of the treadmill yet? I hated the treadmill and would have done almost anything to avoid it in the winter, but I also didn't have a V at that point, which would have made it so much better, especially with the treadmill capability that LifeBeam have been working so hard to perfect. It works seamlessly and will make the time go by a lot quicker. Well, I guess as quick as staring at a wall can go by, right? Even if you're able to get outside and do all your training, V is the perfect running buddy to keep with you when all those fair weather runners are taking their time off inside because it's too cold or too warm. Last month, I introduced you to V herself in these messages as the virtual trainer to keep you company, and she's so lifelike and real. I hope that kind of came across. If you want to enter to win your own V, go to getv.com/runningforreal and you can enter to win. All 3 of our recent winners are loving getting to know her, and you can too. I really enjoy the clear quality of the headphones, and I think you will as well. Make sure you go to getv.com/runningforreal. Earlier on in the show, I mentioned that Body Health Perfect Amino made a big difference to me, and it really did, especially at this time of year when marathon training starts and things begin to get really tough. This is always a time we feel a bit overwhelmed as the accumulation of miles starts to catch up, especially when combined with those hard, heavy training runs. I found that taking Body Health Perfect Amino made my body recover from training that much quicker, meaning I could really attack those long runs and hard sessions. But it's not just for marathoners, it can be runners of any distance. If you get sore or fatigued during training, Body Health Perfect Amino will help you recover too, and here's why. Your body absorbs 99% of the amino acids in Body Health Perfect Amino, compared with only 48% in eggs and 32% in meat or fish. I would take them immediately after a run, and as they absorb within 25 minutes, that would give me a nice amount of time to stretch, another component of staying healthy. Then you can enjoy your post-race meal. Get 10% off at bodyhealth.com using coupon code TINA10. All right, Andy, just 4 more questions for you, starting with, I usually ask people a unique nutrition tip, but we've talked quite a lot about nutrition. So is there anything that we haven't mentioned today that runners might find particularly interesting about something they can consume that will help their running?
Well, there's just a couple of other things on diet that I might mention. One is that when I was working with Nike on this, one of the interventions or innovations that I thought I might be able to add was the dietary nitrate beetroot juice thing. But it turned out that Kipchoge had been using beetroot juice in all his major races for at least the last 3 years. So that surprised me. So, this beetroot juice story has gone way, but actually he's of course got a Dutch management team. So I think they're quite on the ball as to the sort, but Kipchoge loves it and believes that it does work. We did introduce it with the other 2 athletes. The other thing that Kenyans do that is quite interesting perhaps is that they very often run before breakfast. Now we've kind of discussed, you're probably, well aware of this. Your listeners will be well aware of this, that we Now, I'm not saying you should not have breakfast before you race, but actually in terms of forcing some additional muscular adaptation, it isn't always a bad thing to get up and to run. You kind of treat your body or teach your body to adapt in certain ways by so doing. And you can have your breakfast after you've run. And that's something Kenyans do quite a bit. I'm just sort of saying that as a...
So they do it either hard days and easy days?
Especially on the easy days.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
One thing they don't do well, though, is drink very much. So, while they're doing their long run even, they will tend not to drink. Now, the problem with that is that you don't adapt to not drinking. And it's all very well because, all you're doing is training. So you could argue, well, there's no point drinking if you're only training. But we do know that when you run a marathon, for example, that drinking really is important. It will make a difference to your performance. What you can't do is rock up to a marathon if you've never practiced drinking in training and expect to do it properly in the race itself.
Without choking half to death.
Exactly. So one of the things we tried to do with the athletes we're breaking to was to get them a bit more experience in doing that in training such that they could do it better in racing. And we were partially successful, but not fully successful in that endeavour.
Okay, well, very interesting. And just one thing I want to mention, just remind people listening, what Andy just said about not eating before you run, is a good thing to do. But also remember what I said, that they don't necessarily eat their dinner at 5 p.m. So keep that in mind if you are someone who has like an early dinner with kids, that, that will be a lot longer if you're going for your run at 8 a.m. the next day to kind of go without food. So keep that in mind. Okay, what about a running for real moment, a moment that only runners will understand, either in your running career or something you've kind of experienced in your work?
Oh, you'll have to give me some more clues there.
So something like people will mention something that's either was like embarrassing or like a good example is someone talked about that awkward moment when you run past someone and you have to turn around immediately afterwards. So you have to go back past them again. Something that only runners will kind of get.
Well, the thing that springs to mind actually is when I was with Paula Radcliffe and Joe Pavey at a warm weather training camp in Potchefstroom in South Africa one time. Mm-hmm. And I was the guy on the bike, kind of accompanying them. I had some drinks. Mm-hmm. I was kind of the security guy as well because we were running into the wilderness a bit. And we got about 5 or 6 miles out from the hotel we were staying at, and I got a puncture in the bike. And of course, Paula and Joe weren't going to wait for me, so they carried on running, which is only appropriate. But I had to carry this bike over my shoulder, this heavy, mountain bike all the way back, and I was the one that ended up being in possible danger, I would say.
That is funny. It only could happen with those two as well, that someone that big that you'd kind of be like, oh, why did this happen now of all times? So definitely, thank you. What about a high moment for you in either your running or your professional career?
Well, we mentioned, some of the running things that I did. I think the other two things, it's been just fantastic to work with Paula for the duration that I did, and just sharing the highs and lows with Paula, because she didn't have too many people in her inner circle, and you get to know people really well. And it isn't just about sharing of data and the scientific stuff about it. You kind of care about them as a person. And they can phone you up after they've had a bad day or if they've had a good day, and you kind of live and breathe the whole thing with them. And, Paula's certainly had some ups and downs, and kind of going on that journey with her was very special. And, I'm very often in tears watching her achieve things or not achieve things, as the case may be. So that's pretty cool. But then also, getting to know Eliud Kipchoge over the last couple of years has been fantastic as well. I mean, he's not only a great athlete, but an incredible human being and a philosopher. And I just learned, just being in his company, I think is special. When you're with special people, Paula's one, Eliud's certainly another. And I think just sharing any degree of time with those people is a real privilege.
Absolutely. And what a cool thing to be able to say you've done and obviously earned it. I mean, what you've shown today is, you've got the passion, you've got the hard work ethic, and it's cool to see that it has unfolded for you. Now, finally, I do ask my guests to send me a photo of them standing in what I call a power pose. Maybe that would be something people would do before a race or before giving a presentation, something like that. Now, you might not have a power pose as such for doing something like that, but do you have something from your running days that you could share with us, just to kind of show people a real side of you that they can enjoy, maybe a picture of you winning a race or something like that?
Yeah, I'll see what I can dig out.
Okay, great. Well, Andy, thank you so much for your time. This has been absolutely just so interesting and insightful. I really appreciate it, and I know my listeners are going to love it. So where can they find out more about you?
Well, I'm based at the University of Exeter in the UK, and I guess I've got a profile online connected to that.
So they can come knock on your door in your office hours.
Yeah. Well, my email,
get a line.
People are welcome to email me, I guess. Yep. What else can I say?
Andy Beetroot on Twitter.
Yeah, and Twitter. Yeah, follow me on Twitter by all means. Yeah, and I try to kind of, I don't keep it light as such, but I cascade papers that I find interesting, and it generally has a running bias, I would say. But if not, then it's kind of about physiology, health, nutrition, performance. So yeah.
I think many people listening will find the things you share very interesting. So thank you so much for your time. This has been absolutely wonderful.
My pleasure. Thanks.
How cool was that? I mean, I knew Andrew had worked with the best, but I had no idea it was at that kind of level. He is really appreciated in the running world, and it's pretty impressive, right? You can find links to everything we talked about in the show notes at tinamuir.com/episode 49. Now, have you enjoyed any of the Running for Real podcast series yet? These are 5+ hours of dedicated, concise, to the point advice from some of the running world's best experts, from Jada Sherry to James Dunn to Brad Beer. I've recorded 6 to 8 episodes under each of these topics, and you can find them in mental training, nutrition, first-time runners, marathon training, coming back from injuries, and pregnancy/postpartum. Check out tinamuir.com/series for more information, or you can also go to those show notes at tinamuir.com/episode 49. Next one is a very special one. Cara Goucher is going to be on the show for episode 50, and after literally years of trying to get her on the show, I am really excited to have her on here, and trust me, it is worth the wait. Tune in to hear more, and have a great week.
Thanks for listening to the Running for Real podcast. Be sure to check out tinamuir.com for show notes and even more helpful running information.